When I asked what time my son's funeral would be, my daughter-in-law smirked and said, "He's long gone. You don't need to come." I'm glad to have you here. Follow my story until the end and let me know the city you're watching from so I can see how far this reaches. The moment those words left her mouth, the room seemed to shrink around me. I stood in the doorway of their living room, holding the edge of my coat like I needed something solid to anchor me. Just hours earlier, I had been trying to gather the courage to ask her, hoping, foolishly, that grief might soften her tone, that losing my son might have reminded her we were still family. Instead, she turned my question into a reminder that I no longer had a place in his life, or his death. I didn't argue. I didn't ask again. I simply nodded, as if her cruelty were just another formality I needed to endure. The house was quiet, except for the hum of the heater kicking on. A photo of my son sat on the mantel, him smiling at a summer cookout years ago, long before this distance had hardened between us. I waited for her to look away from her phone, to offer even an ounce of kindness, but she only tapped the screen with a little upward curl of her lip, as though she had just crossed an item off her to-do list. I stepped back onto the porch, the cold air of early spring brushing against my face. The sky had that washed-out gray color that always comes before rain. I gripped the railing and took a breath that felt heavier than anything I'd carried in my 70 years. I didn't cry. I didn't plead. I walked down the steps slowly, each step settling deeper into the truth that she had erased me from my own son's final moment. And still, I kept my composure. At the end of the driveway, I paused and looked back at the house, wondering whether my son had ever imagined I'd be pushed this far from him, wondering whether he'd left any part of himself behind for me to hold on to. I turned away before the tears could reach my eyes. They thought I would break. They thought I had no strength left. But they were wrong. The walk back to my house felt longer than usual, even though it was barely a quarter-mile down the road. The neighborhood was quiet, with only the soft rustle of branches brushing against one another in the wind. I kept my eyes on the sidewalk, watching the cracks form little branching lines like roots spreading in every direction. It reminded me of how grief moves, quiet at first, then everywhere at once. When I stepped inside my home, the stillness wrapped around me like a heavy blanket. The living room was exactly as I'd left it that morning. The lamp on the side table, my reading glasses resting on a stack of unopened mail, the blanket draped neatly over the arm of the couch. My son used to tease me about keeping the house too tidy. "Mom, it looks like no one lives here except ghosts," he'd say with a laugh. Now, standing in the quiet, I wondered whether he'd realized how close to the truth that joke had become. I hung my coat by the door and made my way to the kitchen. The kettle sat on the stove, a familiar anchor in a world that suddenly felt uncertain. I filled it with water, set it on the burner, and leaned on the counter while it heated. Every movement felt heavier, slower, as though the air itself resisted me. The house had been empty for years, but today it felt hollow in a new way, like it understood something had been taken from me and didn't know how to fill the space. When the kettle finally whistled, the sound cut through the silence sharply, almost startling me. I poured a cup of tea and carried it to the dining table. The chair creaked softly as I sat down. I wrapped my hands around the warm mug, but didn't drink. My thoughts drifted back to the moment in her living room, the way she didn't hesitate, didn't blink, didn't even soften her voice. As if it were nothing to her. As if sending me away from my son's funeral required no thought at all. I wondered when that line had been crossed, when I'd gone from being part of the family to being an inconvenience. It hadn't happened all at once. Looking back, I could see the little signs now. The missed invitations, the short replies to my messages, the holidays where I felt more like a guest than a mother. My son always brushed it off, said she was busy, stressed, trying her best. I had believed him because I wanted to. The clock above the doorway ticked steadily, filling the quiet with a soft rhythm. I looked at the time and realized that if she had told me the truth, I would have been preparing to leave for the service. I imagined the funeral home, the polished floors, the flowers arranged neatly, the quiet murmur of people offering sympathy. I imagined them gathering without me, speaking about my son, mourning him, remembering him, while I sat alone at my table drinking tea that had already begun to cool. My fingers tightened around the mug, but my face remained calm. There was a strange clarity in that moment, a sense of seeing my life from a distance. I had spent months grieving the slow loss of my son's presence, the gradual fading of our everyday connection. Now I was grieving something else as well, the realization that someone had taken my place in his life long before he died. I set the mug down and folded my hands in my lap. The tea had grown cold, but I didn't stand to warm it. I simply breathed, letting the quiet settle again. It wasn't peaceful, not yet, but it was steady. And in that steadiness, something inside me remained firm. I wasn't finished. The rest of the day passed in small, quiet motions. I tried to keep my hands busy, folding a blanket, watering the fern by the window, wiping down the kitchen counter, even though it was already clean. Grief makes time behave strangely. Minutes stretch, hours slip. I kept checking the clock without realizing why, as if part of me still expected a call telling me the service was starting, telling me they were waiting for me, telling me someone remembered I was his mother. But the phone never rang. As the afternoon light faded, I walked into my son's old room. I hadn't been in there for a while. The door stuck a little as I pushed it open. The room smelled faintly of cedar and old books. His baseball trophies still lined the shelf, their golden surfaces dulled with age. A stack of college textbooks sat on the desk, untouched since the day he moved out. I brushed my fingertips across the spines, feeling the dust cling to my skin. I stood there for a long time, letting the memories settle. Him doing homework at that desk, tapping his pencil against the wood when he was stuck on a problem, him bursting through the doorway full of excitement because he'd gotten into his first-choice college. Him sitting on the floor, sorting through boxes before he moved into his own place, asking me what he should keep and what he should toss. I remembered all of it. Every version of him that had lived in this room. And then I remembered the distance that had grown between us. Inch by inch. How visits became shorter. How calls came less often. How he started saying, "We're busy," instead of, "I'll come by." It wasn't sudden. It was a slow drift, one I tried to ignore because I believed it would circle back. I pulled his old sweater from the closet, a gray one he used to wear on cold mornings. The fabric was softer than I expected. I held it for a moment, then folded it carefully and placed it back. Some things you leave exactly where they are. Coming back down the hallway, I heard the faint buzz of my phone. A message. My steps slowed, a small spark of hope rising despite everything. But when I picked it up from the table, the screen showed only a notification from the local grocery store. Coupons for the week. Nothing more. I set the phone face down, pressing my palm against it for a moment before letting go. Outside, the streetlights flickered on one by one. I walked to the window and watched the soft glow spread across the quiet houses. Somewhere out there, people were gathering for dinners, laughing with their families, holding on to the ones they loved. The kind of simple moments I thought I'd have today. I sat down on the couch, the cushions dipping slightly under my weight. My hands rested on my knees, steady and still. I pictured the funeral home again. Imagined the faces of people walking through the doors, neighbors, friends, coworkers, offering kind words, sharing memories, maybe even wondering where I was. Maybe someone would ask. Maybe no one would. But my daughter-in-law would be there, standing beside the casket, greeting people with that gentle voice she saved for other audiences. I could almost hear her explaining my absence with a soft shake of her head. She wasn't able to make it. And no one would know the truth. A slow breath left my chest. I wasn't sure what tomorrow would look like. I only knew that today had carved something into me, a quiet line that would not fade. I leaned back, letting the room grow still again. The night settled in around me, and I sat with it, unmoving. I wasn't finished grieving, but I also wasn't done being his mother. The night stretched on without asking permission. I must have dozed off at some point, still sitting upright on the couch, because when I opened my eyes, the room was dim, except for the faint glow of the street lamp outside. My neck ached, and my hands were cold. I pulled the blanket over my lap and sat there for a moment, adjusting to the silence that had settled even deeper than before. I stood slowly and walked to the kitchen for a glass of water. The floor was cool under my feet. The faucet hummed softly as the glass filled, and I watched the water rise without really seeing it. My thoughts drifted again, this time not to the funeral home, not to the cutting words spoken earlier, but to the years that built the distance between my son and me. Years I told myself were temporary. Years I excused because I believed life had simply become busy for him. But there had been signs, little shifts in tone. Conversations that ended sooner than they started. Holidays where his visits grew shorter, until they were just quick drop-ins on his way somewhere else. I used to stand at the window after he left, watching his car disappear down the street, convincing myself he'd stay longer next time. I carried the glass to the table and sat down. The house hummed with its usual creaks, the refrigerator settling, the heater clicking on, the faint whistle of wind slipping through the eaves. These were sounds I'd grown used to, the kind that kept me company on nights when sleep felt far away. I thought back to the last time my son and I had talked for more than a few minutes. It had been after his birthday a couple of years ago. We sat on this very couch, drinking coffee. He laughed about something his coworker had said, and for a moment he looked like the boy who used to run through the yard with a baseball glove too big for his hand. I remember touching his arm and telling him I was proud of the man he'd become. He smiled, but there had been something tired in his eyes, something pulled taut. I didn't ask then. I didn't want to intrude. Maybe I should have. The clock on the wall kept its steady rhythm. I glanced at it and realized the funeral must have ended hours ago. People would be home now, slipping off coats, putting leftovers in the refrigerator, talking quietly about the service. I imagined the flowers, the softly lit room, the pastor's voice. I imagined my daughter-in-law standing there, accepting condolences that should have been shared with me. I picked up the glass and sipped slowly. The water was cold, but it eased the dryness in my throat. My gaze drifted to the small wooden box on the shelf, where I kept old letters, drawings my son made in grade school, ticket stubs from movies we saw together. I walked to it, opened the lid, and sifted through the memories with gentle hands. There was a letter he'd written when he was 12, apologizing for breaking a plate and swearing he'd pay me back even though he only made $5 a week mowing lawns. There was a Mother's Day card with shaky handwriting, the kind only a child could make, declaring I was the best mom ever. I held that card for a long moment, tracing each uneven line with my thumb. The distance between us didn't erase the love that once lived here. It didn't undo the years when he turned to me for everything. People change. Life changes them. But a mother remembers all versions of her child, even the ones he outgrew. I closed the box gently and placed it back on the shelf. The house felt cold, but my mind was clear in a way it hadn't been all day. I knew I couldn't rewrite what had happened. I couldn't make her open the door and welcome me in. I couldn't turn back time to the day when my son still called without hesitation. But I could hold on to the truth of who he was to me. And I could hold on to the quiet strength that kept me standing today. I turned off the kitchen light, letting the house slip back into darkness. Tomorrow would come, and I would meet it standing. Morning crept in quietly, slipping through the curtains in thin lines of pale light. I hadn't slept much after leaving the couch. My body was tired, but my mind had stayed alert, circling the same thoughts like a bird that couldn't find a place to land. I moved slowly through the house, opening blinds, straightening cushions, doing the small routines that usually grounded me. Today they felt different, lighter in some moments, heavier in others. I brewed a fresh pot of coffee and stood by the window while it percolated. The street outside was calm. A couple of early joggers passed by, their breath visible in the cool air. A delivery truck stopped at a house down the street. Ordinary things. Life going on. It was strange how the world didn't pause, not even for grief. When the coffee was ready, I poured a cup and sat at the table, cupping my hands around the warmth. I wasn't expecting anyone, so when there was a knock on the door, the sound startled me. It wasn't loud, just a soft, polite tapping. I hesitated for a moment before setting my cup down and walking to the door. Through the window, I saw Mrs. Alder from next door, short, silver hair tucked neatly behind her ears, holding a paper bag close to her chest. She'd lived on this street for decades, longer than I had. She'd seen my son grow up, seen him ride his bike down the street, Seen him leave for college with his car full of boxes. I opened the door slowly. She smiled, though her eyes were gentle in a way that told me she already knew. "I'm so sorry," she said softly. "I heard, and I wanted to bring you something warm." I stepped aside to let her in, grateful for the company, even if I wasn't ready to say much. She set the bag on the counter and pulled out a container of homemade soup, chicken and rice, the kind she made every winter. "I didn't see you at the service," she said carefully, watching my face. I nodded once. "I wasn't told." Her lips pressed together, the expression of someone who understood more than she wished she did. She didn't ask questions. She didn't offer explanations. She simply took the kettle and rinsed it out, moving around my kitchen the way neighbors do when they've known you long enough. We sat at the table with warm bowls of soup. The steam curled softly between us. She spoke first. "Your son was a good man. He adored you." I let the words settle. They felt like a hand placed gently on my shoulder. "He changed," I said quietly. "He pulled away. I don't know when it happened exactly." She stirred her soup slowly. People change under pressure, and sometimes they're guided by the wrong voices. I didn't respond, but the thought lingered. My daughter-in-law's face appeared uninvited in my mind. Her cool tone, her practiced calm, the way she delivered her words like someone stating a simple fact rather than cutting the final string between a mother and her child. Mrs. Alder stayed with me until the soup bowls were empty and the house felt a little less hollow. Before she left, she reached for my hand. "If you need anything," she said, "even just someone to sit with, I'm here." After she walked back across the yard, I stood in the doorway for a moment, watching her small figure disappear into her house. The warmth she brought lingered long after the door closed. I returned to the table and picked up my coffee again. It had gone cold, but I didn't mind. Something inside me felt steadier than the day before. Not healed, not whole, but steadier. Kindness has a way of stitching small pieces of a person back together. And even though the world had taken something from me, there were still bits of softness left. I breathed in slowly, letting the quiet settle again. The day was far from over, and so was I. The rest of the morning passed in quiet motions. I washed the dishes from breakfast, folded the blanket on the couch again, and wiped down the table even though it didn't need it. Small tasks helped steady my hands. Grief sharpens the silence, but keeping busy gives it fewer places to settle. Still, every so often my eyes drifted to the phone, half expecting a message that would never come. By noon, the sunlight had shifted across the living room, landing on the shelf where I kept the wooden memory box. I walked over and touched the lid, but didn't open it this time. I already knew what was inside, and today I didn't need to reopen old chapters to feel their weight. I made myself a sandwich and sat by the window to eat. Outside, the mail truck rolled up, stopping at each house along the street. When it reached mine, the carrier placed a small stack of envelopes into the slot and walked on. Bills, flyers, ordinary mail. Nothing personal, nothing from my son's wife. Not that I expected anything, but the emptiness of the mailbox carved a familiar ache. I sorted the mail at the table and was about to throw most of it out when I noticed one envelope with handwriting. Not printed, not typed. Handwriting I recognized. My breath caught slightly as I picked it up. It wasn't my son's. It was his coworker, Mark, the one he used to talk about often, the one who'd driven him home after long shifts, the one he trusted. I opened the envelope carefully. Inside was a short note. "I heard about the service yesterday. I didn't see you there and wanted to check in. He spoke of you often. If you need anything, information, help, or just someone who knew him well, please call." At the bottom was his number. I traced the edge of the paper with my thumb. It wasn't long, but it was kind, and kindness feels deeper when you've been denied it elsewhere. I set the note on the table and looked out the window again. Clouds were gathering now, thick and low, the kind that turn the afternoon into an early dusk. The wind picked up, rustling the branches of the maple tree in the yard. There was a stillness beneath the movement, a quiet that felt more thoughtful than empty. I rested my hand on the note. I didn't know if I was ready to call him. I wasn't sure what I would say, or what he could offer beyond a voice willing to listen. But the simple fact that someone noticed my absence, that someone cared enough to ask, it softened something in me. I moved the note to the corner of the table so I wouldn't lose it. Then I stood and began straightening the room again. The chair, the throw pillow, the stack of books. None of it needed tending, but the motions felt grounding. As I reached for the TV remote to check the weather, a sudden knocking echoed through the house. Not soft like earlier, firmer, more deliberate. I hesitated, then walked to the door. Through the window I saw a car idling at the curb, and on my porch stood someone I hadn't expected. Not today, not after everything. It was Mark. He looked nervous, shifting his weight from one foot to the other, holding a folder in his hand like he wasn't sure if he should be here. I opened the door slowly. "I'm sorry to come by unannounced," he said quietly, "but there's something I thought you should know." The wind brushed past us, carrying the smell of damp earth and the faint threat of rain. I stepped aside and let him in. The quiet inside the house deepened. He held the folder with both hands, almost protectively, and for the first time since the day began, I felt the air shift, like something important was finally finding its way to me. I didn't speak. I simply waited. Mark stepped just far enough inside to close the door behind him. He didn't remove his jacket, didn't sit, didn't move any closer than the edge of the rug. He stood there as if the air around us carried something delicate, something he didn't want to disturb. I nodded toward the living room, and he followed me in, careful, quiet, his shoes barely making a sound against the floor. He held the folder a little tighter as he sat on the edge of the couch. I lowered myself into the chair across from him, my hands folded neatly in my lap. The room felt smaller now, as though it, too, sensed that whatever he brought would settle heavily between us. "I wasn't sure if I should come," he began, his voice low, steady, but weighed with something unspoken. "But after yesterday, I didn't feel right keeping this to myself." He opened the folder slowly, revealing a small stack of papers, printouts, a few handwritten notes, and something that looked like a form with official markings. He hesitated before handing me the first sheet, almost as if he wanted to give me a moment to brace myself. "This," he said softly, was what he was working on not long before he passed. I took the page carefully. The text blurred for a moment before my eyes adjusted. It was a handwritten letter, unfinished, but unmistakably his handwriting. My breath stilled. I traced the first line with my eyes. "Mom, I'm sorry I haven't been around as much. I need to fix things. I didn't realize how far they'd gotten." My fingers tightened around the edges of the paper, but I kept my expression calm. Mark watched me with a steady, respectful silence, giving me room to absorb each word. "He talked to me a lot these last few months," Mark said, his voice steady but gentler now. "About feeling trapped between loyalty and pressure. About wanting to reconnect with you. I think he was trying to set things right." I kept reading. "I should have stood up sooner. I should have made sure you knew everything." The sentence stopped abruptly, trailing off mid-thought. I rested the page in my lap, smoothing the creases with my thumb. Mark continued carefully. He mentioned wanting to change a few things, legally. There were documents he planned to revise. He nodded toward the other papers in the folder. "I don't know all the details, but he wasn't hiding anything from you. He was trying to protect you." The word protect settled in my chest with a quiet ache. For a long moment, neither of us spoke. The heater clicked on, filling the silence with a faint hum. Outside, a light drizzle began tapping against the window, soft and rhythmic. Finally, I looked up. "Why bring this to me?" I asked, not accusingly, just searching for the truth. "Because you weren't at the service," he said simply. And everyone noticed. Her explanation didn't make sense to me. He would have wanted you there. He loved you, even when things got complicated. The calm in his voice steadied something inside me. He set the rest of the folder on the coffee table, sliding it gently toward me. "You don't have to look at everything now, but I thought you deserved to have this." I nodded once, a small movement but sincere. "Thank you." He stood, sensing that I needed space more than conversation. "If you ever want to talk," he said, "or if you need anything at all, you have my number." I walked him to the door. The rain had picked up, pattering quietly against the porch. He gave me a small, steady nod before heading back to his car. When the door closed behind him, the house didn't feel quite as hollow. The folder sat on the table, waiting. I didn't open it yet. I simply rested my hand on it, letting the weight of the moment settle around me. My son had been reaching back toward me, and someone else had made sure I never saw it happen. I stood there in the quiet, not shaken, not broken, just clearer than before. The house felt heavier after Mark left, but not in the same way as before. The weight now had shape, direction. I walked back to the living room and sat down slowly, the folder resting on the table like a quiet truth waiting for me to face it. I didn't open it yet. Instead, I let my fingers brush over the edge, feeling the slight texture of the paper beneath my skin. Small details can steady a person when everything else feels uncertain. Outside, the rain softened to a mist, blurring the edges of the yard. I watched it through the window, breathing in the muted calm it offered. My son had been trying to reach me, to repair something, to make things right, and someone else had stood in the way, firmly, deliberately. It was a thought that settled slowly, like dust floating down from a shelf that hadn't been touched in years. I finally opened the folder. Inside were a few emails printed out, a draft of a legal form, and another short handwritten note, unfinished like the first. His handwriting leaned slightly to the right, the way it always did when he wrote quickly. I don't know how to explain everything yet, but I'm working on it. Mom, I just need a little more time. The line ended there. I closed my eyes briefly, letting the words sit with me. He hadn't given up. He hadn't walked away from me. Something else had pulled him further than he meant to go. I placed the note back into the folder and folded my hands in my lap. My breathing was steady, my thoughts sharper than before. By late afternoon, the rain stopped. A soft, silvery light settled over the neighborhood. I stepped outside to check the mailbox again, not expecting anything new, just needing the motion. When I looked across the street, I saw her car turning the corner, my daughter-in-law. She slowed when she saw me standing there, but she didn't stop. Her eyes flicked toward me only briefly, cold, calculating, almost annoyed that I still existed. She pulled into her driveway with a deliberate slowness that felt more like a statement than a simple arrival. She stepped out of the car, smoothing her coat with precise, practiced movements. For a moment, our eyes met across the street. A quiet, heavy moment. She was the first to look away. I didn't wave. I didn't call out. I simply stood there by my mailbox, holding the stack of empty envelopes, letting her see that I wasn't hiding inside my house. I wasn't collapsing the way she expected. I wasn't shrinking. I walked back inside and closed the door gently. The house settled around me again, but this time the air felt different, more alert, more awake. I returned to the living room and sat down with the folder in front of me. My fingers hovered over the documents, not out of hesitation, but out of a calm decision to move at my own pace. I didn't need to rush. The truth wasn't going anywhere. I read through one of the printed emails, a message from my son to Mark. I have to talk to her soon. She deserves the truth. She always has. A small exhale left my chest, not a sob, not a sigh, just a release of something held too tightly for too long. As evening crept in, I closed the folder and set it aside. The quiet around me felt steadier now. Not comforting, but grounded. I stood and turned on the lamp beside the couch, its warm glow filling the room. I smoothed the blanket one more time and looked at the space around me. My home, my memories, my proof that I hadn't imagined the love between a mother and her child. Someone had tried to erase my place in his life, but they couldn't erase the truth. Not anymore. The evening deepened, pulling long shadows across the floor. I turned on another lamp, letting the warm light settle over the room. The folder sat beside me on the couch, closed for now, but still carrying the quiet pulse of everything I had learned. I wasn't ready to open it again. Not yet. Sometimes truth needs a moment to breathe before you face it a second time. I stood and moved slowly through the house, straightening the same things I'd straightened earlier. A habit more than a necessity. My fingers brushed across the framed photos on the hallway wall. My son at 8, grinning with missing teeth. At 16, standing beside his first car. At 23, wearing a graduation cap slightly tilted. Each picture felt like a small door into a time when things were simpler, when love was the only language between us. I paused at one photo, him at maybe 10 years old, standing beside me at a pumpkin patch. His arm was thrown around my waist, and his smile was so wide it seemed to tilt the whole picture. I remembered that day, He had insisted on picking the biggest pumpkin even though he could barely lift it, and he kept saying, "Don't worry, Mom, I'm strong." He had always wanted me to see him that way, strong, capable, determined. Somewhere along the years, someone else had convinced him that strength meant turning away from me. Or maybe he thought protecting me required distance. I didn't know yet. But the boy in these photos hadn't planned for things to end like this. I walked into the living room again and sat down slowly. The sound of a car door closing outside pulled my attention. I glanced out the window. My daughter-in-law was stepping out of her house, carrying a small box to the trash bin. She moved quickly, head down, posture tense. When she lifted the lid of the bin, I saw something. Papers. What looked like folders, maybe envelopes. She hesitated for a second before dropping them in. I didn't move away from the window. I didn't hide. I simply watched as she stood there longer than necessary, scanning the street as if checking whether anyone had seen. Then she turned and walked back inside, her steps stiff and hurried. A quiet awareness settled over me. I didn't know what she'd thrown away. I didn't need to know. Not yet. What mattered was the way she moved, the way she looked around, the way her shoulders tightened as she re-entered her house. People only act like that when they're guarding something, or when they feel something slipping out of their control. I stepped back from the window, letting the curtain fall into place. My heartbeat stayed steady, calmer than I expected. I returned to the couch and picked up the wooden memory box again. This time I opened it. Inside were the small pieces of a life. Ticket stubs, birthday cards, a tiny plastic dinosaur he'd insisted was lucky when he was 5. I lifted that dinosaur now, holding it between my fingers, its faded green paint chipped from years of being carried in pockets and backpacks. I closed my eyes and let the memory of him fill the room. His laugh, his curiosity, the way he'd fall asleep in the back seat after long days. That boy had loved me without hesitation. That boy had grown into a man who, even in his final days, tried to reach back toward me. The distance hadn't erased the truth. I placed the dinosaur back in the box and closed the lid gently. The house was quiet again, but not empty. Not tonight. I wasn't sure what tomorrow would bring, but I knew the silence between me and the truth was beginning to thin, and I wasn't afraid of what I would find. The next morning arrived without ceremony, slipping into the house through the thin break in the curtains. I hadn't slept much, but rest didn't seem necessary. My mind felt sharper than it had in days, steadier somehow, as though the truth sitting inside that folder had finally settled into its place. I rose slowly, made a cup of coffee, and stood by the window while the steam curled upward. Across the street, her house was quiet. The trash bin sat at the curb from the night before, its lid slightly crooked. I didn't look long. I didn't need to. Some truths don't require watching to confirm. I took my coffee to the table and opened the folder again. Not all the way, just enough to look at the legal draft near the top. My son's name. The faint outline of his signature where he had started to sign but hadn't finished. A form requesting changes to his beneficiary. A section noting medical preferences. Notes scribbled in the margins. His handwriting, quick and uneven, like he'd been rushing. I ran a finger under one sentence. Mom should know everything. The words pressed against me gently, as if reminding me that the version of him I'd known wasn't a memory. He had still been trying, even near the end. I set the document down and leaned back in my chair, letting the quiet fill the room. It wasn't peaceful, not yet, but it wasn't hollow either. There was something living in it now, a direction, a beginning. Around mid-morning, I heard a soft sound outside. A truck pulling up, then a knock at the door, firm but not loud. I opened it to find a man in a navy jacket with a clipboard. He introduced himself politely. "Ma'am, I'm here on behalf of Whitmore and Lawton," he said. "Are you Mrs. Turner?" I nodded. He handed me a sealed envelope. "These were requested to be delivered to you. I'm sorry for your loss." He left before I could ask anything else. I closed the door gently and carried the envelope to the living room. The seal was crisp, unbroken. My hands were steady as I opened it. Inside were documents, official ones, bearing the letterhead of a law firm I recognized from the papers my son handled years ago. There was a cover sheet at the top. Per your son's instructions, these materials were to be sent to you directly. I read the sentence twice. Inside were copies of revised financial forms, drafts of updated legal arrangements, and a planned amendment to his will. He hadn't finished signing everything. Some pages were incomplete, but the intention was clear in the margins, in the notes, in the lines he had underlined himself. One page held just 3 sentences in his handwriting at the bottom. I need to explain this to Mom myself. She deserves to know why things changed. I should have told her sooner. My chest didn't tighten. My breath didn't catch. Instead, a quiet calm filled me. The kind that comes from finally seeing the shape of something you felt for a long time but could never prove. I placed the papers neatly on the table, smoothing the edges the way I always did with important things. The truth wasn't loud. It didn't shout, didn't accuse. It simply stood there, clear and unmovable. He had tried to make things right. He had reached toward me, even when he couldn't bridge the distance fully. And someone else had stepped between us, managing the parts of his life he was trying to reclaim. I looked toward the window again. Her house sat still, ordinary, quiet. Nothing about it revealed the layers beneath. I didn't feel anger, just clarity. The truth was here now, and I knew it wasn't finished with me yet. The envelope sat on the table like a quiet verdict, its pages spread neatly where I'd left them. Morning light moved slowly across the room, brightening the edges of the documents one by one, as if illuminating each truth in the order it wanted me to see. I sat with a fresh cup of coffee, both hands wrapped around it, letting the warmth settle into my fingers while my mind pieced together everything my son had tried to tell me. Everything he never got the chance to finish. The house was still, but not in the lonely way it had been before. This stillness felt deliberate, like a pause held open for something important. I read the lines again, the ones written in his handwriting. The words were uneven, rushed, but full of intention. He had been trying to make things right. That thought didn't bring comfort, but it brought truth. And truth has its own kind of steadiness. A car door slammed outside, not loud, but sharp enough to pull my attention. I set the cup down and stood, walking to the window. Across the street, she was stepping out of her house. My daughter-in-law, her posture tense, her movements clipped. She glanced around before heading to her car, a folder tucked under her arm. For a brief second, her eyes met mine through the glass. She looked away immediately. I didn't wave. I didn't move. I just watched as she drove off, her car disappearing around the corner. Something in her rushed pace, the stiffness in her shoulders, told me she already sensed a shift. Something she couldn't name, but felt tugging at the edges of her control. I went back to the table. I wasn't sure what I expected to feel. Anger, sorrow, some sharp rush of emotion. But what settled inside me was something quieter, something firmer. Not revenge. Not yet. Just clarity. By mid-afternoon, the sky darkened with a low stretch of clouds. I picked up the envelope again and placed it in a drawer where I kept my important papers. As I slid the drawer closed, another knock sounded at the door. Soft, hesitant. Not the firm, practiced knock of a stranger. I opened it to find Mark standing there again, hands in his pockets this time, shoulders hunched slightly as if bracing against something heavier than the weather. "Can I talk to you for a minute?" he asked. I nodded and stepped aside. He entered quietly, glancing around as though unsure whether bringing the outside world into this space was allowed. We sat, not across from each other this time, but with the coffee table between us, close enough that his voice didn't have to rise above the gentle hum of the heater. "I didn't tell you everything yesterday," he said. "I didn't know if it was my place." He ran a hand through his hair, a nervous gesture that didn't suit him. He talked to me about pressure, about things at home that didn't feel right. He wanted to come here more. He wanted to tell you what he was changing, but every time he tried, something stopped him. I didn't interrupt. I didn't need to. I knew exactly what something meant. He said she wouldn't like it, he continued. He didn't want to start a fight. He didn't want to make things worse. My hands rested in my lap, steady. His words didn't surprise me. They only filled in the outline I had already begun to see. Mark hesitated again before adding, "He wanted her to treat you better. He said he was tired of making excuses for her." The quiet between us deepened. My throat didn't tighten. My eyes didn't sting. I simply breathed, letting the truth settle into the space it belonged. After a few minutes, Mark stood. "I'm sorry," he said softly. "You deserved to hear it from him." I walked him to the door. Before he stepped outside, he paused and lowered his voice. "If you ever need help understanding the paperwork, or if anything else comes up, let me know." He trusted you more than anyone. When he left, I closed the door gently and leaned my back against it for a moment. Not out of exhaustion, just reflection. Everything was aligning now. Not neatly, not cleanly, but clearly. I returned to the living room and sat on the edge of the couch. The room felt different again. The kind of different that comes before a turning point. I folded my hands together, letting my thoughts settle. My son had been reaching for me, even as someone tried to pull him away. The documents were proof. The letters were proof. Mark's words were proof. And though he hadn't finished everything he intended, the truth he left behind was enough. Outside, the clouds shifted, letting a narrow band of sunlight fall across the floor. It was faint, but steady. I watched it stretch slowly toward the table, toward the drawer where the documents now rested. I didn't need to hurry. The truth was here now, quiet but unshakable, and I would carry it forward, calm, steady, prepared. I wasn't done. The rest of the afternoon passed in a quiet I no longer feared. It felt different now, aware, steady, almost purposeful. I moved through the house slowly, touching the backs of chairs, straightening framed photos, letting each familiar detail anchor me. Grief was still here, but it no longer swallowed the room. It sat beside me instead, patient, waiting for me to decide what came next. As evening settled in, I opened the curtains wider. The sky had softened to a muted blue, the kind that comes just before dusk takes over. Porch lights flickered on up and down the street. Life moved around me, steady, ordinary, yet something inside had shifted for good. I went to the drawer and took out the envelope again. Not to read it, but to hold it. The weight of it felt different now, not heavy with confusion, but solid with truth. My son had tried. He had reached for me even when it was difficult. Nothing anyone did could rewrite that. I placed the envelope back in the drawer, closed it gently, and stood for a moment with my hand resting on the wood. A small, closing gesture, a quiet acknowledgement. Outside, a car turned into the driveway across the street. My daughter-in-law stepped out, carrying a bag of groceries. Her posture was stiff again, her movements careful. She looked toward my house, a fleeting glance, quick and sharp. But I didn't look away this time. I stood by the window, calm, watching her look, and then quickly turn her eyes down. She wasn't in control of the narrative anymore. She knew it. I didn't need to confront her. The truth had already drawn its own boundaries. I walked to the kitchen and made a cup of tea. The kettle hummed, releasing a faint cloud of steam. I carried the cup to the table, wrapping both hands around its warmth. For the first time since the day she denied me the right to say goodbye, the ache in my chest loosened just enough to let in something gentler. Resolve. I thought of my son. His laughter in the backyard, his messy handwriting on birthday cards, his unfinished letters trying to bridge a distance he never wanted between us. I thought of the boy he had been, the man he became, and the last small truths he left behind for me to find. Those truths were mine now, unbroken, untouched, and entirely beyond her reach. The house was quiet again, but it no longer felt hollow. It felt full of memory, of clarity, of a love that hadn't ended just because his life had. I stood and opened the back door, letting the cool air brush across my face. The yard was still, washed in the soft glow of the porch light. I stepped outside, breathing in slowly. For the first time in days, the air didn't feel heavy. It felt open. "I'm here," I whispered into the quiet. Not to anyone listening, just to myself, and maybe to him. And I won't disappear. I closed the door gently behind me and walked back inside, leaving the night where it belonged, outside, still and patient. The story didn't end the way I wished it had, but I wasn't erased. I wasn't pushed aside. I carried the truth with me, steady as breath. And that was enough.